we're going to get started, guys, I'd like to thank you all for coming. Last presentation of the year and sticking around. I know everybody's ready to get out here for the semester, so I appreciate it. I'd like to start by thanking my committee for the semester of hard work. I really appreciate all the help you guys gave me. I'd like to thank my classmates for all the help you've given me the past few weeks as well. I'd like to thank Cameron Hughes for letting me borrow his computer to do this presentation today. So with that, I guess let's get started. So I'd like to start by just asking you guys to quickly imagine a world with no water. What would that be like? Well, it might feel a little bit like this guy, I guess. Water's pretty important to us. We might even feel a little bit like this. Water's the reason we're here. Our bodies are made of a lot of water. We need to drink water every day. We love to recreate on it, especially here in Minnesota, so that's a great thing as well. But also quite often we find water doing things like this to us, putting us in situations that we really don't enjoy. The Red River Valley, up a little bit north of here, every year seems like they're cussing at the water, asking it to get out of here. Storms like this form out over the ocean and come onto our coasts. A lot of damage has occurred and such. Things like this happen. We can't drive places. We're lazy in America. We can't drive. We've got to get the water out of here. And we often find ourselves thinking, why won't all this water just go away? So with that, I'd like to introduce the name of my project, Urban Water Emergence, Resiliency and Adaptation for an Urban Coastal Community. So this is my project. It's going to be mostly digital today if the computer works out, and these will kind of supplement the presentation. So let's get started. Here's a picture of the United States outlined, and the United States has roughly 5,000 miles of coast in the 48 states, which is quite a bit. Also, about 3,700 miles of that, 75%, is in the danger of getting hit by hurricanes in the south and the east, which is quite a bit every year. Coastal populations are 123 million people in 2010. That is a ton of people. Coastal population has seen a 40% increase since 1970. And its density in coastal communities that have waterfront on them is 446 people per square mile. That's quite a bit considering the average density of the U.S. is 105 people per square mile. So there's a lot of people on our coasts, and they enjoy being there. And the coastal population is expected to increase 8% by 2020. So there's going to be more people flocking there every year, another 10 million people to the coast. So it's going to be a really crowded place. So we kind of have this issue that seems to be forming of water and our need for water and our need to be by water, as well as some of the things that aren't so great about it that I've discussed previously. And how do those two things add together or interact? So let's take a little bit of a journey and an exploration of this topic. And we're going to be looking at the Gowanus Canal, which is in Brooklyn, New York. And I will do a little bit of a zoom in here so you guys can see where we're headed. There's the East Coast. You can see Long Island there in Manhattan. And then the Gowanus Canal is right here. It's just a small canal. It's 1.8 miles, runs up into Brooklyn there. Give you orientation. Here's downtown Manhattan, and New Jersey is over there. So that's where we're going to be looking. And as I'm sure all of you are very familiar, Hurricane Sandy is very recent in all of our minds, and that had a very big impact on the city of New York. A lot of flooding, a lot of damage, and a lot of people saying, hey, something's not right about this. What are we going to do in the future to help alleviate problems like this or issues like this? So I did some explorations into mapping the sort of impacts of water on the Gowanus Canal. And what this is looking at is taking into consideration, so this is what the Gowanus Canal looks like today. The blue outline is the canal. This dotted line is the line that Hurricane Sandy rose up to for its storm surge. This map here is a picture of what the Gowanus Canal might look like in 2080 with projections of climate change and those sorts of things. So you can see there's a lot of area that's now underwater that isn't today. Some projections have global sea level rise on the East Coast being as much as 5 feet above where it is now in 2080, with things like rapid ice melt from the solar ice caps and such. So that's a pretty staggering image there. This image here looks at what the current 10-year flood event would consume as far as land in the Gowanus Canal. This here shows the newly 100% inundated all the time area of the canal. And the lighter blue area is what we would consider a 10-year storm event. But by 2080 and with global warming, it is now happening once every single year. So if your house is within this 2 or 3 block area of the Gowanus Canal, it's either underwater, or if your business is there, it's underwater, or it's flooding once every year. That's a lot of new furniture, a lot of cleaning up. And then this map, again, looks at what the 500-year event would be today and what the 500-year event would be like in 2080. And what's interesting to note is that currently a 500-year flood event is about a Category 2 hurricane on the East Coast. By 2080, it'll be a Category 3. So it's going to be stronger storms can be becoming more prevalent. So if all of these things are going to be happening, and if this area that's currently a certain land use along the canal is now underwater, in the future, it won't be able to be that. Those functions that are there now will not be able to be sustained. So we need to think about a way to transition our uses around the canal in the future. And so this is a first crack at a map that would think about a way that we could begin to break down the canal into a series of zones that might have a new type of land use or a new sort of spin on an already functioning land use there that would be a lot more resilient to flooding and storm surge and those sorts of issues. And some of the land uses that might happen here would be things like an integrated seawater agriculture, which I'll talk a little bit more about a little bit, energy creation or cultivation, adoptive or transition to communities. A new sort of paradigm in industry might be able to take place along the canal since it is an industrial, post-industrial area in places now, as well as issues looking at the canal has a lot of issues with sewers overflowing during rain events into the canal, which make it a really nasty, disgusting, smelly, unhealthy place. So thinking about ways that we can change how that might work in the future as well. So this is a master plan that I've come up with for my project for the Gowanus Canal, and I'd like to go through it more in depth here, but it's just kind of an overview, and it's also up there so we can reference it. And we're actually going to take a little bit of a journey through 3 smaller sections, one here, and then finally one down here, to kind of get an idea of what some of these uses might be more like on the ground. So this is 2080. There we go. So we're going to take a look at the first sort of section up there in the northeast part of the canal. So this works. So this is going to be a little bit of an animation. We'll be able to see what the water is going to do to the canal by 2080. So that's some of that area that has been encroached on. Some of the area that is going to be flooding. A lot of this once every year by 2080. This is the existing condition. But that might start to make some changes and things will be phased out. Buildings won't be able to withstand the sort of flooding. Businesses won't be able to withstand the sort of flooding either. And so we'll might be able to start to think about different strategies of either protecting ourselves, keeping the water out, or raising ourselves above it, or possibly staying within it. So what does that mean, and what are those kinds of strategies? They might take the form of a dike structure that could protect what right now is a very strong community of Carroll Gardens, a very wealthy neighborhood, have a lot of really critical infrastructures like schools and churches that are pretty close to the canal. Versus on the other side, we might start to think about raising ourselves above this new water level that's going to be there. And a reason for that might be because a lot of this area is in a post-industrial kind of phase and is going to be more heavily impacted by the waters than this one, so it might be a better place to think about transition rather than kind of pushing back against. So on this side, if we think about what's going to be happening here, if we put a dike up, what happens to the land on the outside of the dike? Well, it becomes a new use, and that's this idea of integrated seawater agriculture, which might begin to take existing post-industrial structures and turn them into tilapia or shrimp farms. And those tilapia or shrimp farms can then be used, the effluent water from them can be used to irrigate and provide nutrients to fields that could be grown on adjacent vacancies. Fields crops could be salicornia, which can be used, the seeds can be used to create biofuels, which would create energy for the area. Once the water is filtered through that sort of agricultural process, it could then again be filtered through a series of wetlands along the edge of the canal, which might even include cypress trees by this time in 2080. They're only 160 miles to the south in Delaware right now. It create a really kind of cool atmosphere, and by that time the water would then transition back up into the canal. And so that's pretty cool. All the stuff on this side of the dike is a new use, and all the stuff on this side is protected. But what is the dike itself. Is it just a dike, or is it multifunctionary in some way? Can it serve the community or what's happening next to it in another way? So can we begin to think about protection and possibly a recreation network, possibly areas for the community to utilize, things like market space, things like there's a school adjacent here, so is there a place for the school kids to get out and play on it and do those sorts of things? So thinking about a dike not just as a dike, but also as a piece of the community, an integral piece that's helping protect as well as to move the community forward in some way. So now let's think about what might happen on the other side of the canal. An area where there's a lot of post-industrial places right now that will be phased out in the future. Possibly we could extend some plinths of earth that would raise us up above what will be the new 500-year flood level, which would be 26 feet in 2080. And these plinths could be constructed out of dirt that has been cut from other areas in the canal that currently needs to be cleaned for industrial pollution anyway, so we can begin to kind of utilize that process in multiple ways. And these plinths could become new communities that are extended down from the existing one up here towards the canal. And they might have a sort of interesting development strategy on top of them. They would be modeled a little bit off the kind of classic New York City brownstone model, but with a little bit of a twist, which I'll get into in just a little bit here. So there's a little bit of a closer look at the plinth, and you can see kind of this classic brownstone development that would be there, but it's a little bit tighter, a little bit more squished. There's just two small access roads that would allow for vehicular traffic, and the focus is transitioned to some public open space along the periphery of the plinth that's raised up. In addition to that, there are, at the current block rates where the cross streets would go through, some cross sections that would happen, and where these two systems interact, community nodes would begin to form. At the end of the plinth, where you'll be about 20 to 25 feet above the existing grade, another sort of node would be created that might be anchored by some sort of commercial or entertainment district with a larger public plaza, as well as a really interesting system of getting down, a vertical movement system. So it might consist of a long ramp, or possibly pulling some of the materials from these post-industrial buildings along the canal back to create some industrial follies or walls that would help us terrace and ramp to get down to the canal, possibly integrating some pools into that as well. And so there's this really interesting system along the edge of the canal that pulls the community down to it. And this is a shot of the canal cut out. And if we're, of the plinth. If we're going to cut these plinths away, or build these plinths, that provides an opportunity to rethink how we do our sewer systems, since we're going to be ripping up all this infrastructure anyway. So let's say we have the chance to kind of implement new sewer systems here. That allows us to capture some of the sweet rainwater that might be coming down and hold it under the plinth in some sort of cistern that we can then use, because by this time in 2080 some of the rain events we're having are going to be stronger and more intense, but they also might be less frequent, more time between them. So this sweet water is actually going to be really important to capture and hold, and how are ways that we can do that. And then also maybe this water that we're capturing can be used in this sort of end of plinth, really interesting kind of landscape as well. And so with that, I'd actually like to turn your attention to these three perspectives here, which are of this sort of section of the canal. The first one here is looking on the dike. So it would be standing here, looking this way out across these fields. You can see the fields down here. Some of the old post-industrial buildings might be transitioned to an agricultural use. You could have school children and market space there, so a really kind of active place. This perspective here is looking along the canal at what might become this kind of canal garden park area. There is a little bit of a lack of open space for the communities in this area, and if we're adding new ones, that would be a really strong piece to kind of give people in this area more open space. And so you might begin to see these old footprints from old industrial buildings in this park that you can move in and out, and really are interesting when things are flooding. They fill up sometimes of the year, they're empty other times of the year. It's a really dynamic experience. And then this is a perspective looking from the edge of one of these plinths out over the top of the system to get down. So we're up on top of this kind of public plaza here that might have a commercial building along it, and there's this interesting system of pools and ramps and terraces that lead us down to the canal. So that's kind of transect one, and looking at these different strategies for how we might begin to live with this situation. Let's take a quick look at the next transect, which is this one. If my computer wants to cooperate, maybe show up, but otherwise is this area right here. And this this kind of strategy is going to be looking at some different options along the canal, not necessarily a residential one. So again, we're right here. And we might begin to think about what are some uses that we can do that will be really productive for us, while at the same time might address some of the existing issues we have, things like the sewer overflows that are really disgusting, and make this what would be a really nice place to live not so nice sometimes. So you can see here that possibly with the water rising, we might also kind of embrace that and cut more areas for the water to come back into the communities, things like canals or possibly some shallower oyster beds, and think about how those could be utilized. We also might think about how this is, the new water level will have raised up 5 feet by this time. So the existing outfalls for where our sewers are coming out into the canal will now be underwater all the time, and they won't work. So one of the things we might do is we might pull those outfalls back and use that as an opportunity to rethink how we treat our sewage. And one strategy for that might be actually to utilize oysters, which oystering is a well-known and loved sort of industry in the New York area. It's coming back more and more every year. One of the byproducts from oysters are obviously oyster shells. So what do you do with them? Well, it's actually studies have been done that show if you crush up oyster shells and heat them to 750 degrees and then run effluent water through them, they've been proven to take out 68% of the phosphates from that water. If you add nitrogen to the heating process, they can be as much as 98% effective. So this is probably an opportunity to use that kind of byproduct from the oystering business as a filter to help clean up our canal a little bit. And some things along the canal, some of these old industrial relics could be used to do that process. The process they use is they spin the water with the oyster shell, so you could use these old tanks to spin the water and release it out, possibly through another system of wetlands to clean it again, and then back into the canal where the oysters will again filter it and become oyster shells to clean the process, so it kind of becomes a cyclical loop again. Another strategy to think about would be with these canals that get cut in, is there a way to utilize that as well? And another option is to think about growing algae from this effluent, because there's a ton of nutrients in effluent and algae grow off nutrients. So is there a way that we can begin to grow algae in this area? And say, why would you want to grow algae? This makes my lake ugly. Well, actually algae can be used to make things like biofuels as well, and NASA's actually working on a system right now that's called OMEGA, which stands for Offshore Membrane for Efficiently Grown Algae, that they've been working on to kind of transition to using for jet fuel. And so this is a quick video of how that OMEGA system might work. So the effluent would be pumped in via pipe underneath into these they're often tubular membranes that hold the algae in them. And the algae then feed off of the nutrients in the effluent, as well as off of CO2 that can either be introduced with the effluent or can be extracted from the atmosphere, along with sunlight, which is really important for photosynthesis as well. And then what's interesting about this process is that the natural wave motion from sitting on water helps stir the algae in the effluent, increasing the pace at which the algae are able to grow. So it kind of increases the way that this product gets produced. So if we take a look at a little bit closer zoomed in view of what these canals that get cut in might look like, we can see that we would possibly run these pipes down the center of them that would begin to feed these different membranes filled with algae that could then be harvested. But what else happens is with these canals, there's area in between them. So what does that get used for? Well, some of it's used for maintenance and harvesting of the algae, but other pieces of it could be used for a public infrastructure like parks or recreation, or possibly just naturalizing the edge of some of these canals to make more habitat available for other sorts of critters and creatures that inhabit the canal as well. So you can see there could be this sort of banding strategy that happens along these canals that would provide for a really interesting kind of live, recreate, kind of working waterfront, as it were, on a smaller scale in this area. So, and before we go to the next segment, I'd like to just point out a few of the perspectives here. So this is a perspective looking at from one of the top of those kind of algae canals. And in the top section, we've actually cut back into the earth, so we're having to deal with, again, this vertical kind of system. So that's not quite as conducive for harvesting algae. It's a little bit hard to get down in there when it's that deep, but we could kind of produce this system of lowered tiers that this is not a lake. It has tides that happen every day, and they're stronger some days and other days and really dynamic. So that might become a really interesting system for the public that would then use this as a night perspective that might be looking from standing about down here looking out at where possibly some of these membranes come in. Maybe they're lit from the bottom, so the algae are glowing at night would be really cool. And this kind of becomes like this energy creation kind of place that people could celebrate, and possibly there's a festival of light every year that the algae help produce. So, and then this perspective down here on the bottom is looking at kind of those industrial tanks that would be used for filtering out the effluent with the oyster shells, and some people oystering it and what that experience might be. So we'll move on to the final kind of section we're going to look at here, which is just down in the kind of southern portion of the canal there. And currently there's a lot of industry that happens here, post-industry, and some communities up here. This is a very kind of strong community. And again, this animation will show some of the flooding that happens, and it's going to happen quite frequently. And especially in this area west of the BQE, this area is going to feel a lot of that flooding once a year type, if not more, flooding. And so what does that do? Well, some of these industries will have to phase out, but the industrial nature of the canal is actually really well liked by the people that live there, and they kind of want to keep some industry there, keep some jobs, so we might begin to think about a new way to do that. But in addition, these communities that are going to be flooding, maybe not quite so frequently, maybe once every few years, they maybe don't need a transition strategy or a protection strategy like some of these other areas do. We might begin to think about a new strategy where possibly developers would see an opportunity here that they could begin to offer build-to-suit type of development. So a group of people get together and say, hey, we really want to live here near the canal in one of these areas that's a little bit away, but it's still going to flood every so often. Would you build us something that would suit our situation? And so what happens then is they might come in and start to construct these communities that have uses on the first floor, maybe first 2 floors, that are floodable, whether that's a model like things that happen in Venice, or if it's parking, or if it's sort of indoor public plaza space, whatever that might become. And then the residential area is then up above that flood level, so they don't have to worry about getting their unit flooded every so often. And one thing that might happen as well is that this area, which I'll discuss in a little bit, might relate to the industrial area happening down by the canal, and begin to really embrace this production idea and think about how can we produce our own things here, gardening, that sort of thing. And there becomes these different kind of levels of stratification of ground level, kind of Green Street garden things, and then a patio experience, which is more private as well, and then maybe like a rooftop kind of gardening, vegetable production phase, as well as then probably, again, a system of capturing water, so thinking about a blue roof strategy, how do we capture this water that's falling here instead of letting it run into the canal, how can we really begin to utilize those sorts of things. So I guess we'll let this go a little bit further, but so those strategies are kind of talked about here a little bit. And next I want to kind of zoom back into this section, which is talking about possibly a new type of industry in the canal that we could talk about. It's frozen a little bit, but it should be going soon. So this industry might have transitioned to a possible little bit of a different use. This little image here shows that it's going to have to deal with similar things to this community up here, and that the first 2 floors are going to be flooding once a year. So what does that do for our kind of industrial thing? Well, one thing that might happen is we might build up a little bit higher, and we also might take some precedent from other places like Portland along their waterfront where they have a floating walkway, and begin to do that in a larger system of possibly these floating pads, which are larger spaces for these, possibly a new type of industry that's focused on production, local production, artistry, brewing, wineries, those sorts of things. So they could have whatever they need to do, whether it's hops for a brewery or vines for a vineyard, along those pads. And then when the flood levels come in, which might affect these first floors, which again could be sort of like public plaza space inside or display space for these kind of businesses or industries that are happening there, versus when the industry, more industrial traditional processes are up above, then these pads could begin to float. So I guess this kind of sequence right here shows how that might happen. It's from this point kind of here looking up along this row of industry, kind of at these few pads here, and you can see that when it starts to rain during a flood event, these pads will begin to raise up higher and higher along these poles that they're kind of attached to, and thus whatever use is on top of them isn't flooded and is still viable when the water recedes again. This is kind of just a larger perspective of what that might look like. Possibly the system of lighting on the poles that these pads are attached to give a little bit of a subtle hint at what the different flood levels are. So those could be located at a 10-year flood event, a 500-year flood event. So it would help people register that, even if it was just subconsciously that, oh yeah, this is where the flood level was last year when that came up and flooded my friend's place down on 2nd Street or whatever. So And I guess with that, I'd like to just wrap up by saying water is really important. We need it, just like this bird needs it. It's a source of our life, and we kind of really need that. But often we end up feeling like this. So how do we move into the future and not feel like this? Well, I think that with strategies like this that could be implemented in an area like the Gowanus Canal that seems like a really good opportunity to do something like this, that we could begin to not say, oh crap, it's going to flood again. We could say, oh cool, it's going to flood again. Let's go check it out. And with that, I'd just like to leave this perspective for now. Thank you.
I just wanted to say, very impressive presentation, Eric, and video. So, I mean, I'll let other people comment first about all the design and work and technology, but I just in working with you this semester, just been incredibly impressed by how much work, iterative work, research, representation, learning new skills to represent your work, especially this time-based media, which is a perfect way to talk about flooding. So I just kind of kudos on that level. So water guys, turn it over to the water guys.
Relation to that, remember, Eric sent me an email and he's like, well, you know, I'm working with this new paradigm. I think I need a new way to communicate. He's like, what do you think? So I'm like, it's like midnight or whatever. I've got like 8 or 10 different videos. So I sent him this link, and I'm thinking, no way is he going to take the bait on this. And sure enough, so well done.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
I think overall, you know, it's really interesting to think about a project like this from a Capstone experience, and begin to think about an understanding of the complexity of cities. We chose New York City of all cities. How the complexity of the urban environment, the complexity of issues related to policy, the complexity of issues related to existing conditions of CSOs, contamination, are all kind of interwoven in your project. And I think it was really important the way you started out by talking about water and the paradigm towards water. You realized early on that Hurricane Sandy was changed the game. Thinking about paradigms and that change. The crisis became a trigger to think about new dimensions. So I really applaud you for kind of wrestling with the complexity of this project. And the thing that you didn't talk about was going to the site many times and being there cleaning up garbage with the neighborhood and engaging local architects and landscape architects in the process to get their perspective. I just wanted to call attention to that because this isn't a project that just operates kind of within your own head. It's one that you've consulted with local community members and the old salt who knows everything about this place since the beginning of time or before that, and sitting in his living room drinking coffee. So I think that's the kind of the subtext of this project that I find is really interesting because I know you brought a lot of those perspectives and concerns to the table. It wasn't necessarily just you thinking abstractly on it. So kudos for that. The other thing that I talked about this semester is the idea of how to tell a story, right? And it's about the cake and not the recipe. And this is an awesome example of that, where this is the type of presentation that you can give to a local community group. The language you use when you talk about plinths, you clarify what the hell a plinth is. So the language you use and that overall approach, to me, really suggests that you're ready to launch in your professional practice. That if I'm in an office and I'm a principal and I need to think about who's going to be doing the work, who's going to be going to a presentation, I know full well that after seeing you present a couple times, that this is something you're going to be you can start to jump in and be able to manage projects really be the voice of whatever type of practice it is. So I look forward to seeing your work with this.
I would just say that for a really complicated place and a complicated set of issues, your presentation was incredibly clear. The video certainly helped a lot. The fact that you took it on and worked it and came out with a product that could provide the kind of clarity for something that's that complex is great. It's a great outcome for you that you gained that skill. What strikes me about it is there are scales of design. And some of us choose to focus on small, definable things that we can build. Some of us focus on grand scales of things that we can strategize about. It strikes me that where this lies in that continuum, if you will, is this strategic or visionary planning aspect of design. And from that point of view, it's incredibly brilliant in terms of how you took a place that was industrial, post-industrial, as you described, and as a neighborhood, is a place where people work, is a place that some people love, even though it stinks, as you've described. And you didn't just make it a pretty park for the future, but you described a strategy such that it could be remade into something that is economically and community viable moving forward. So, in the sense that you didn't design, like take this space here in the bottom perspective, you didn't design specifically that thing. What you did is you set up a strategy whereby that space is something that could happen and could be implemented and could, with community input at that point, really be designed and become a really viable place. So the scale of your design intervention seems really appropriate for the complexity of the issues and the time frame that you described. And I think what would be, for me, as a designer, what takes that thing to the level, if you, like he talks about the cake and the recipe. You know, part of the recipe for you would be, if you get them to buy into a vision, is, okay, the next step is, how does it happen? How do you make a plinth in a place like this? How do you create a dike that is resilient for this time frame? How do you pay for it? And I think the other critical part that is left that's really more complicated than all of this is how you choose where these things happen. Because all the land you've described is embedded with thousands of individuals who work there or own it or live there or rent there or grew up there or are representatives of those people. And as you know from all the previous proposals, trying to get them to move in a direction is really difficult. So I think that part of the really heavy lifting of something like this is a vision. And I think the vision is really clear and strategically well thought out. The other heavy lifting part is getting people to agree on specifically where it happens and how. And I think that that's where the recipe can come in. You as a designer can come in, or you with other people in government or in the community can come in and say, okay, let's develop policies or let's develop guidelines about the kinds of places that should be protected. You described it when you said in the neighborhood here, there's a lot of resources. There's homes, there's schools, there's transportation network. That deserves to be protected. If that translates over to an agreeable set of principles that could actually spur that kind of implementation, that would be great. That'd be a great outcome. And if you can not nudge that group towards those kinds of thinking, because that's the battle that will be incredibly, incredibly difficult. Not so much that you can't envision this, it's just my mind can't even wrap around how you can implement this. You know, I don't know at the scale of this big place how it would happen. I think that getting people to buy into something that seems hopeful and seems appropriate is half the battle, and I think you've done a good job with that.
You.
Yeah.
So you introduced, this is all great, by the way, and just kind of thinking about
process and your rigor and really kind of going after what it is to be part of being on the sea is really interesting. And you introduced the idea of catastrophe and how these kind of more catastrophic events are going to be happening. And I see your response to tides, but I'm wondering your response to, say, kind of these, I mean, hurricanes have winds.
Yeah, that's, I was wondering about
100+
that
miles
too.
an hour.
Yeah.
And waves that are how do things like your floating planks, or I mean, I was sitting there thinking about plants, maybe not modeling those out of something that could actually cause pollution, like the ground feel types of soils, but maybe there are pieces of those remnant buildings that you use as actual, I mean, those types of gigantians. That's the whole thing is built as a fluctuating thing with a large pore space, so you can bring the water in without actually messing with the stuff that's above it on that design. So, if you don't mind talking
Yeah, I
about
can
that.
talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'm
Actually,
curious.
I was thinking about that stuff last week or the week before. I was emailing with Matt and a couple other people about it because that's one of the issues that I kind of explored in this were like the flooding and the contamination, the disgusting situations. But there's a whole other set of issues like waves, wave action, right? So like how would these plants actually be designed to not just wash away when the floods come in? Well, that's like a whole other issue. I had some original ideas about that the kind of edges of these plinths would be kind of like a reinforced vegetative wall sort of thing, but that along the toes of them you would have to sort of construct some sort of stronger armoring system, that's riprap or some other kind of system that could begin to sort of dissipate some of this energy. And I did do some explorations earlier on in the semester, quite early on, about like what does wave energy mean and what does the dissipation of that mean. And that's kind of like a whole other project too, just to understand the physics of it and those sorts of things. And I didn't get into thinking about the wind too much. It was constantly in my mind, but I had to
Next steps. Yeah, I was going to say, I definitely, I mean, it's those things, like you said, it's another project, but it'd be interesting to see them thinking about it, because, like you proposed those moisture beds, I mean, they're probably not something, I don't know that much about the quality of them, but I'm guessing they don't take a ton of that kind of disturbance regime. So even having those kind of support structures to protect them could be then an additional layer that you can say, okay, now not only am I responding to the day-to-day fluctuations of tide, but then I'm responding to catastrophic events, which says, okay, in the future then I'm responding to what these kind of large events are going to be happening in the future. I'm armoring New York against the coming storm. You know there's a competition, right? I'm sure these guys
Yeah.
told you. Okay,
Yeah,
good.
I was in contact with David Briggs, the founder of the Quantum Design Competition. I've been on the team a few times.
Yeah, so I really encourage you to collapse it, because I think they've got a one board requirement or something like that.
Yeah, well, their competition for this year just wrapped up, and it was really specific on just like parcel.
Right.
A little bit more architecture.
There is a competition, the watermarks competition.
Yeah.
Berkeley's hosting.
Oh, that's right.
And the issues you're talking about are great. Can you talk a little bit about, you talked with David Briggs, you talked with Eric Weiler as well, and I'm wondering if you could then maybe reflect on that conversation with him, or conversations, and tell us a little bit more about how that changed your attitude towards the idea of levy, when some of the larger strategies.
So yeah, I talked with Eric Wayland from FEMA while I was out in New York City, and we've been in contact with him before that as well. And one of the things that really came up was that FEMA was doing a whole lot of remapping and a lot of recalibrating after Sandy to figure out, okay, where did we miss a step, or what do we have to prepare for in the future? And one of the things that was coming up was that a lot of stuff that FEMA does is on a like a risk value basis. So if it's worth the sort of input you're putting into it, we'll do it. But if it's not, then we're not going to do it. And one of the conversations that came up with him, sort of off the record, was that FEMA has the idea that some places like this, or even more so out on the edges of the coast that are currently protected by dikes and larger structures, that sort of risk value kind of benefit won't be there in the future. They won't be able to afford to justify making some of those decisions to invest in hard infrastructure or to invest in keeping all the water out like the Netherlands does every day, every year. So after that conversation, it kind of allowed me to really think about, okay, if I'm actually setting 2080 as my goal date for this, by that time a lot of these kind of infrastructures that are in place right now to protect us, they won't be viable anymore, they won't be worth keeping up. So how do I begin to transition into sort of a new paradigm of protection or resilience or adaptation? So that was really kind of helped move my project forward a little bit. And as well as after talking to him and some of the community members out there, what I thought was interesting was I talked to a whole number of community members when I was out there. I went to, there's a conservancy called the Kiwanis Canal Conservancy, which does cleanup events once a month at the canal and is really involved in the canal. And I went out to help coordinate one of their cleanup events earlier in the year as well. And I talked to a lot of people at these, and all of the people that I talked to know what the issues are. And especially with Sandy being so recent, they all realize that, I was in to talk to an architect whose office is, her office is right here. It's like literally 40 feet from the canal. And I went into her office and she let me in the front door and she goes, look, you can see there. And it was 6 steps up into their office and the carpet was all gone up to that level and everything on the main floor was gutted. And she goes, that's where Sandy came up to. She goes, luckily our offices are upstairs, the architects down here lost everything that they didn't take with them. So, people know that changes are coming, that they need to maybe change the way they think about this stuff, and that possibly the ways we've always done things, they might work for the next 10, 20, 30 years, but at some point we're going to have to transition to something new to really be sustainable and to be happy living in a place like this, right?
So the presentation technique, those little anecdotes you shared, think about how those can be incorporated into a presentation, where you can take those kind of moments where you're talking about larger design, and then you remember Duarte kind of talking about the different fill-in, and you begin to think about how those anecdotes could be the positive, the antithesis to the fill-in of Sandy, which only positions your work even stronger, because one, it shows you've been listening to local people, two, that some of the anecdotes are true, people understand, and three, it also reframes your work against the villain.
Well, your project makes me think about what about, do we have to have all sorts of new kinds of power plants or generators and utilities and infrastructure? I mean, there's the fact that you're talking about the outfalls and changing all that infrastructure. It's like, oh my God, so sometimes, like you said, you've already researched and framed and done all this work, and then look at all the other layers. One thing that would help me, I mean, sometimes it's hard to evaluate things. I mean, I can feel and know the power of this from working with you, but things like the oysters, the algae, all the innovative things that you've talked about. And because there's been work around some of those research, like you brought in the NASA thing, I think that's helpful. I don't know, you've already, there's so much to talk about, but maybe just icons or something in your book. It's like, what are the main moves? Well, there's this thing about oyster and this algae and this whatever, and they do these things in kind of a systematic way, and that research supports this. So this is the leading idea, but look at what my project's done with this leading idea. Or nobody's thought about this plinth idea because nobody can figure out how to. Sometimes that's really helpful too, like you're building on things people really like and could work, but you're doing it in your own, powerful way, in your own vision. I think that would, a lot of times that brings people along in your story, like, oh, okay, even if they've never heard of algae or oysters, and you're like, oh, yeah, wow, and then all this stuff, I can do that. So it was, it's rather an amazing amount of research. Everything I would send to Eric on some blog, some new thing that I'd seen, he'd already seen it. I mean, he was on all the same. So it was, yeah, it was really impressive how much. And if no matter when you emailed him, he would email you back. Like you said, Matt, midnight.
One thing you did that I think is helpful as you talk to the community is you talk that far out in the future. Is you don't look. You talked about some specific things like that's actually strategically helpful because if there's a community there, they want to envision themselves there in the future. And when you offered multiple possibilities of what these could become, and you weren't really hard and fast about it, that's actually really helpful because a person who's there and is invested could say, oh yeah, they almost interpret it in their own way and say, oh, I could use it for X, or that's a great idea, I would like to do this in that particular spot. And I think in certain cases that's really helpful because you don't want to alienate people and say, I'm changing your land and I'm going to make it this. And then they get really uptight and they feel like, no, you can't do that, that's my thing. But if you always are somewhat open-ended and inclusive to say, no, we want all these people to be here. We want you to be back. We just want to re-envision how and where it's going to happen such that you can work with water. So I think using that kind of strategy and how you talk about the potentials of some of these places as more flexible is really helpful.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of why the non-specificity of some of the real detailed proposals for me works. In a lot of cases I will be harsh on people for not being specific, but for me it works here because it is that scope of change that wants to be really heavily open-ended in some respects.
You couldn't get away with that unless you have perspectives, because that helps us get into some of those spaces and understand what they might feel.
Yeah, they were representational instead of very specific and literal too, like if it was a visionary project. So,
Bob?
for last thing, I actually just wrote a blog about this. I was kind of forced into it, but it was actually a good exploration. Yeah. So the twisting of the arm on this actually was really cool because it made me start to think about utilities and specifically our water utilities and how they kind of came to be. And we started this type of construction with impervious surface and streets in response to disease. And since then, the curve has held us back and we haven't really responded to land. It's been basically our floodplain. And I think this is a really good step forward too, to think about how do we start to bring water, because our disease is completely different, and our ways of disease control are completely different, and our technologies are different. And so we can start to let the water back into the landscape, and so I really applaud you for going after this, and especially to think about how the subsurface structure can be different, because we don't need those types of constraints in place anymore. So that's really good. I think this is really a cool step forward, especially thinking about how to use that subsurface structure for use. And on a bigger scale rather than just a block or even just a single site. So it's really
Who else has a comment? Bob, do you have a comment?
I applaud everything you've done. What I also like about it is that, this isn't the only canal, and so I don't know if this was part of your thought process, but it really seems like you've been able to create a model that can be applied to other places, because this is, as you point out in your presentation, going to happen all over the place. So the notion of the resiliency factor, the flexibility, some of the open-endedness, all of those are really important strategies that can be applied to other places. So the idea that you are very place-based and specific, is great, but also the fact that you're able to, look at creating a model for how to apply this to other places on the East Coast and even in New York. That's pretty cool. I also like that, and you didn't talk about it much, but I'm feeling it as I look at your perspectives, describing the essence of the sense of place. There is a certain quality that you are, that I see characteristically through all of your perspective work. So it seems like, you've made some intentional design moves here in how you're depicting the quality of the space, which is really nice. So,
The canal definitely has a very unique feel there. Just the people that live there, the businesses that are there, the canal itself. When you hear the Gowanus Canal, you know you're in the Gowanus Canal. Especially because you can usually smell it.
Great job. Wow, pretty fancy. Well, I'm gonna just call because we're gonna have a little celebration thing. But Christine thinks it's at 5.
Yes.